Happy Earth Day, everybody. Today we're doing a special episode on this Wednesday to celebrate Earth Day and to celebrate the conversations that, we're having in the arts and our artists, our current exhibiting artists are having. So today I'll be joined by Nicholas Kahn, Richard Selesnik, our artist in residence, and Michelle Montjoy, our regional artist. Before we continue the conversation, I want to give our daily shout out to Barrels and Branches, dubbed one of San Diego's top 10 nurseries by San Diego Home and Garden magazine. Barrels and Branches is truly a hidden sanctuary. Hidden behind a long wall near the end of Santa Fe Drive in Encinitas, Barrels and Branches offer climate-appropriate plants, as well as local organic fruits and vegetable seeds and seedlings. They're open 8 to 5, 7 days a week. And Victor's sharing their website as well. So, if you're looking to start some projects, start your own garden. I've thought about it myself. So, great. All right, I want to welcome Nicholas and Richard and Michelle. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you again on this long distance call.
I know, right? So it's a really surreal experience, but, on topic, everybody meeting virtually now has actually really changed a lot in the environment. And I'm sure you've heard about it as well, the decrease in greenhouse gas emissions and, all these different things. So there's good and the bad. But let's start talking about some of your work and some of the themes that you're discussing in your work. So
that's Richard's ours there.
I know. I was like, what better way to start with your Eisenberg-Freistadt conversation? So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this project and kind of situate it for us.
I'll let Richard.
Okay, yeah, we started this project, I think, in about 2005. And when we started it, it felt to us like that in the kind of general economic world and the housing market, we're living in New York and things seemed very, very bubbly. So that was one thing. The other thing was it was the first project where we really started to try and think about climate change and how we might get some of those themes into a project. So we had kind of those two strands of kind of things we were thinking about when we started the project. So what we did was we kind of started looking at history and at the hyperinflation in Germany in the early 1920s. And so we took that strand and we decided to kind of combine it with a kind of like a fictional event of this giant iceberg that had broken off from the ice flow and somehow floated down to the German city of Lübeck. I think that a little bit came from there was a lot in the news then of a giant break in the Antarctic ice shelf. And there was a huge kind of table iceberg that was almost the size of Belgium. And so that really caught our attention. So really it was these things we were kind of like, that were filtering through to us from the news and what was going on while we were doing the project.
Yeah, and I was intrigued about it. My dad was in World War II in Germany, and he brought back some banknotes that were like 10 billion mark notes, which always intrigued me as a kid. How could the world be without money when money is worthless? And so here you have an image of a character on an iceberg who is seen defecating money, as one might say, into a pan, and that very image did appear to some degree. It's a famous German image that they sometimes made in marzipan. Sometimes they depicted it on banknotes at the time of a person shitting out money in, and it's tells you how worthless money really is. So some of the banknotes that were created during this time of hyperinflation were critical of what was going on in the economy and how useless money really is. And that aspect of that particular project, where we were trying to link the madness of caring more about money than the environment through this fictional event that took place at the exact same time as the real hyperinflation happened in Germany, is very apt for today's moment, where we're finding this really odd mix where suddenly we can get rid of capitalism everywhere in the world at once to some degree and see it is possible to change the environment that rapidly. No one had a clue that this could ever happen this way. But it's perfect to demonstrate where we can go to save the earth really quickly if we all get together. We'll try and do it in a way we don't kill everyone, but it's an amazing moment in history.
I think it's really fascinating, and it shows one of the powerful things about art is that we get to explore these hypotheticals, right? And really learn from them. You created this hypothetical situation that right now is so poignant. We can actually learn from this exploration. And I think in there lies some of the power in art in making these changes, especially when it comes to ecological issues that we're facing. I want to move to you, Michelle, because I think you also address kind of this hyper-consumerism through your materials, and in a different way, but you're using it. So maybe you can speak a little bit towards your material in relation to consumerism and materiality.
Yeah, it's really interesting because before COVID, my thinking was so much more about how destructive capitalism was, how we need to be paying attention to this, the amount that we're using, all that sort of thing. And like Nicholas was saying, we are in this great experiment now of showing how we don't need this. We don't need to be using all this. I mean, how many clothes have you worn in the past month? There's the sweatpants. I mean, it's really kind of, I'm fascinated at this shift, and I really hope we do kind of save some of it. But for me, when I was working, there was, especially on this borrow pit project, it was kind of right on the heels of everyone Marie Kondoing their closets and cleaning them out, and then all they seemed to be doing was buying more clothes. And I live in Southern California, and it's very much got a mentality of a lot of clothing and wearing it all the time and not really thinking about the strands of what you're doing. And so in my work, I really want to sort of explore a little bit of that story that's in the cloth. Where did it come from? Where does it, how do you use it? What do you use it for? What's the story that is contained in it by your story? You're wearing it. And then also what happens to it when you're done? And where does it go? So I don't know if that all conveys in the work, but that's always the kind of stuff I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I picked a couple details from your installation at Lux, and I think it shows so beautifully the kind of changing of your perception, because in this previous image, you can tell really well that these are clothing textiles. But when we look at your installation, they really have morphed into something different, and kind of the ability of this material to adapt. But then when you look at these details, you get to see those little things that we recognize, that we associate with, and then that kind of brings it back to that original conversation you're having.
Yeah. It's interesting. I would say my work is more informed. I do a lot of hiking in the desert, and my forms are more reflective of these really odd, spooky things that grow out there that have, nighttime blooms and strange sort of things like that. And they're very isolated, but they also are very dependent upon each other. They grow in the shade of each other. They only have, the Joshua trees are all spread out because they only have this amount of nutrition, per square foot, things like that. So I don't know where I'm going with that, but that was sort of what I was thinking of the forms themselves in these, and the fact that they're human beings. Each one of these hanging objects is a single person's clothing. So I wanted to make that connection, you know, kind of straddle between the person who it is and, you know, natural forms, that we aren't very different.
Yeah, and it is interesting too, because you're then bringing up identity, right? And do you feel that it's maybe a commentary on how we shape our identity based on the things that we have, and kind of wanting to play with that? Or how do you look at that?
That you got that. Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's so many parts of clothing, and, you know, there's a number of artists that deal with that also, but yes, identity is part of it. And then again, it's a basic need. And where do we tip on that continuum of we need to be clothed, but then when does it become ridiculous?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think about those sorts of things, because in this environmental conversation, I mean, nobody's perfect. You know, you can drive a Prius and compost and all those sorts of things, but we're all making compromises. You know, I go to the grocery store and live in guilt because I don't know where this, you know, how do I buy this kind of thing?
Yes. How to make the right choices. And
right, exactly.
I think, you know, that's something that's really overwhelming for a lot of people. There's so many issues that we're facing, and so many different choices that we need to make on a daily basis in order to, you know, and I think a lot of people feel a paralysis when it comes to those things. Like they are struggling with how to make those changes and how to, you know, I think right now we're learning really well that we're actually quite adaptable to change because of the situation we're forced into. But before, I think we were really struggling with making those big changes. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that seems to be being talked about a lot at the moment is how throughout history, when pandemics or plagues have happened, that they've had long-lasting effects in terms of changing people's behavior, kind of rejiggering the kind of order of things. So it's hard to imagine that all this, you know, isn't going to have run-on effects. And like Maria was saying, I think it's true that I think after all this is over, to me, it seems likely that, you know, people are going to think more about like spending money and buying a lot of things. To me, it seems like it's going to have a run-on effect, whether it's by people thinking maybe I don't need this stuff, or maybe there's just less money in the system for people to buy this stuff. But it's bound to have run-on effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, you know, this ties really nicely into work as well, and kind of this, at least in some, there's a lot of different things to unpack in these two images, right? But part of it is this appropriation of the materiality, the consumerism, and in some ways it almost feels like we become our own consumption. We become, we almost drown within that materiality. So I saw these images, and in relation to Michelle's work with her appropriation of these works, that's one of the big things that you do as well, is to find all these found objects, create new storylines with them. I don't know if you'd like to speak more to that.
Absolutely. Like the character, the bat-suited characters made out of fur coats that various friends of mine donated to me, and I found used. Everything was like from when people had great pride that they could show off how much money they had by buying the mink coat of their dreams, and that's the furthest thing from our mind now. So there's a lot of coats that with little holes in them from moths, and that people still are storing away, and they stop wanting to spend money on that. So people donate me fur coats to make sculptures like my bat character in that one, and the ropes from the fishing industry with old tackle for our character made the kind of monster from what we've done to the seas by all the nets that are tangling up all the fish. We wanted to have it come back as something like a evil monster of the deep there, and it does look a lot like some of Michelle's knitted structures. And yeah, just about everything is in that pile that's floating there. We wanted to reference a bit of the Dust Bowl imagery of everyone being nomadic when they're no longer able to live on the land. When we rape the earth so much it blows, the soil blows away. And then here as well, like Fukushima, when the waters rise and everyone's possessions are floating out. And it was a mix of all those kind of feelings of flight and what do you take with you, and it's all junk in the end anyway. And that was, we had a sense that was our near future.
I think also doing a lot of work like we do on the landscape in Cape Cod, that was essentially a landscape that became a Dust Bowl landscape. When settlers first went there and chopped the forest down, they got maybe, I don't know, they got like maybe, 15 or 20 years farming out of it before they just used up the soil, got down to the sand, and then the whole thing just became a big sand bowl. And then gradually, over time, after farming stopped, the forests came back. So we kind of witnessed the kind of regeneration of the land that can happen when it's kind of used with a lighter touch.
Mm. Yeah, you guys also touched upon something interesting, which this image sparked too, and made me put in this next image with the rising water levels and kind of, this in some way absurdist approach that you're taking to, the extremes of measuring rising water levels, but at the same time, it doesn't seem that far off. What were you thinking when you created this piece?
Yeah, well, I actually remember when I was growing up at my grandmother's house on the Somerset Levels, which is a part of England that's very low lying, a lot of it's below sea level. I remember the nearby village, she would always point to the top of the church tower and say that that was where sea level was. And they actually had a little mark up there. And so it's kind of like shocking seeing just like, you look up at this very high thing and that's where sea level is. And the kind of the barricades and stuff they had to the sea there would occasionally get overrun and you'd get this flooding. I remember my grandmother's house was, the water would go all around it. Like even though you couldn't see it with the naked eye, somehow the house was on a very slight rise higher than the land around it. So the seawater would actually kind of flood around it. So some of those kind of memories from childhood kind of like made a big impression and kind of inspired images like this.
It reminds me of the Netherlands myself.
Yeah, well, it's actually the Dutch that came and drained that part of England.
Yeah, there's this really interesting book. It's called What If? I'm blanking on who the author is, but they explore these really extreme questions. And one of them is, what if all of the ice is melted and the water is easier than we thought? And talking about how the Netherlands is going to dominate the whole world because they have such a mastery of civil engineering and those types of infrastructures. Little side note. But I think what is really interesting too, moving on to this image, and I think, we all, with ecological change, we have very strong associations with the polar bear image. But what I find so striking about this is the hybridization between human and polar bear. And it's broadening up the conversation to, it's not just the polar bear's apocalypse that, ecological change is presenting. It's our own apocalypse. It's our own end of the world. And I love kind of that hybridization where human becomes man, man becomes human, and then in these two images, it really becomes about who ultimately is controlling who, right? Are humans controlling this hybridization, are animals controlling this hybridization, I find really interesting in the larger conversation about how to make change, how to speak for the rest of the planet. I don't know if you have anything to say to that.
Well, yeah, I adore animals and trying to find empathy and seeing the world through what is it possible to see the world through their eyes and how they must see what we're doing to their world. And so hearing in the latest news of this pandemic that it could have come from the pangolins, who I've been caring a lot about, or it could have come from the bats and and I'm just trying to imagine. I often tell stories through speculative fiction, creating kind of plot lines in my head that are fantastical, a Kafkaesque storyline, and that ends up being what we see in these images. And one just imagines the kind of pangolins plotting together in the wet market of Wuhan, picking up this disease from the bats, and they collaborate together on how they can possibly reverse this thing and change the whole world on this really amazing individual level. So yeah, I have costume desires and designs for any possible animal. If I can wear the costume of an animal, then I can start to understand their point of view in a strange way, that the sort of absurdism and that theater allows you to go into that state where you start to change your perspective. And I think a lot of all this is changing our perspective and seeing how the planet is so interconnected with every species, and we need to stop being so human-centric.
Yeah, I think putting on the costume allows us to create more accountability for that we're portraying. I think that's really a great way of looking at it.
I love that, you know, the entrance in through the absurd that you guys bring to this is just, I mean, it's a super powerful message, but coming in with, you know, absurdity and humor and a little bit of tongue-in-cheekness is really, it's a phenomenal approach. I think, you know, it's not heavy-handed, but it's so powerful too.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, no, darkness is always around us, so we're trying to sweeten it with beauty and hit you below the belt using the humor,
right.
And maybe we'll bowl you over enough that you start to shift your perspective very slightly.
Yeah, and I think that's all we can expect as artists. You know, we just are trying to nudge it a little bit, a little bit of empathy. Maybe you'll understand this if you just, yeah, climb in and see what's happening.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I love this image on the right, where it feels like this marriage, where there is this synchronicity between the two, that, you know, if only we can find that synchronicity, we can find that beauty. Which brings me into your work, Michelle. And I think you're also working with this hybridization specifically for this installation, this man-made versus natural, this morphing from one to the next. Tell us more about the inspiration for this.
Yeah, a lot of this was also informed by the Overstory by Richard Power, which I was reading at the time.
Love that book.
Oh, thanks. He's an amazing writer, and that's yeah, totally incredible. But that connectedness that we have, that I think we don't think about often. And so instead of, you know, aspen trees and mushrooms, they all kind of connect underneath, but this is, you know, a connection that's all up above, and it's within the architecture of this man-built space, you know. And so I really wanted to work in an organic way against this really strong vertical and horizontal kind of feel of that, especially that grid up there. The part that's a little wistful for me is that all of these forms you were meant to climb into and and be in and kind of smell and feel and touch and stick your hands in. And I have fur in this one that you're supposed to put your hand in. And, you know, for me, that was going to be a lot about sort of breaking the rules of what do you do in the white cube gallery. You know, this is a different kind of approach. And, you know, for me, I'm always asking questions. I drive people nuts because I'm asking, why can't we do this? Why not? You know, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of artists work that way. So, you know, yeah, it's neat to look at this as a picture, but I really wish the kids were in there climbing around, that, you know, the adults would jam themselves into those tubes or anything like that. So.
I can imagine some of the scenes in Overstory where they were high up in the trees and plotting against the people who were chopping down the trees going on in just this kind of environment.
Exactly.
It's
So
lovely.
thanks. So at the very end, when I realized that there were no people going to be in this, there are little tiny sweaters. I don't know if you can see, the black one is hanging up there in the middle, but little tiny figurative sweaters that are now like the little gargoyles in the piece, because they're all that get to inhabit it now. So those were my, and then I also laugh because my middle daughter is an environmental scientist now, and she swears it's because we used to watch Fern Gully all the time.
Oh, I love how your work becomes more animated without the presence of humans.
Right. Oh.
You know, what happens to the world if only we were absent from it for a little while? Does, you know, the sculpture come alive and start inhabiting the space and interacting with it?
We'll see. Who knows what it looks like now? Maybe it's grown all over.
Yeah, it does. I want to move on to what Nicholas and Richard are currently working on. A lot of the issues you're bringing up has to deal with insects. You're working on these flags that are expressing their power and their hope and their wishes. Can you speak a little bit to the ideas that are coming to play here?
Well, I'm interested in the interconnection of the insects and plant life and us, and how we are losing so many of them. The amount that we used to experience when we were children to now, it's astronomical, the difference, and how critical it is that we preserve habitat for them, that we rewild the landscape with native plants as much as possible instead of lawns and monoculture in the farms in the Midwest. If we can bring that back, we have a chance to save the insects, because without these insects, we are not going to be eating anything. And once we get through this particular COVID apocalypse, we've got the lack of insect apocalypse facing us square on. And so our characters are going to be wearing veils, carrying these flags on their back, marching in a sort of mournful parade to try to send spells through wind, hitting these as like the Tibetan prayer flags that are all activated by the wind. And they will be doing panoramic photos of a variety of these flags worn by these black-veiled characters, and hopefully sending signals out there to the insects that we are trying to atone for what we've done to them, and that we're all attempting to rewild the landscape and work in harmony with them, so that maybe they come back and help us live a little bit longer, a little bit better together with them.
I think also the insect it's a little bit like the bat. The insect's like it's like a kind of underdog. It's like the insect is like a kind of unsung hero. So we kind of feel like if people can identify more with, you know, not just like the, you know, the big spectacular animal like the polar bear or the tiger, but if they can really identify with the insect, then it feels like that's a really good starting point, because you're starting at, you know, the creatures that are all at the bottom that make the base of the pyramid, that like, you know, all the upper levels on the pyramid will all kind of come down like dominoes if you don't attend to what's on the lower levels of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the reasons I have not yet brought up bats is because we're doing a talk with Winifred Frick from Bat Conservancy or Conservation International. So she'll be diving a lot more into the different issues that bats are facing, which is why I haven't asked you guys about that. But I think, you know, Nicholas, you brought up this really nice thing about this working together, and I think, you know, part of the role of art is to bring people together in order to make these changes. And Michelle, you a big part of your practice is this social practice aspect to it, is bringing together communities. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, my work is very political in a lot of ways, and after, especially after the last election, all of us were feeling incredibly helpless and a little bit hopeless about the fracturing that was going on in our country, that had been going on, but it just got, ridiculously, terribly awful. So two friends of mine and myself, Anna O'Kane and Siobhan Arnold, and I started a project called To Do, a Mending Project. And this picture is from a previous project where I knitted with groups and used used t-shirts, and we sat around a table and looked each other eye to eye and talked. The Mending Project, we took that idea a little bit farther, and we offer mending. If you bring in your torn clothes, we mend it for you. And we did it at the Museum of Contemporary Art and also another gallery in Little Italy. And so we'd mend clothes, and then we also offered free workshops in all sorts of things that people knew how to do. And we just asked our artist community, what do you know how to do, and do you want to teach it for free? And 30 people said sure. So it's interesting now in hindsight, because it was how to make your own pasta and how to make your own salsa, and then how to read silently together. We did all sorts of sewing on buttons, how to glue things together. And now that we're all stuck in our homes, it's so interesting how many of those skills that we were espousing so that people could be less capitalistic and could, gather and learn together. Now we're using it all alone because out of necessity, people are baking like crazy now.
Yes.
Yeah, as we all are. So it's interesting, that the reverb that happens in social practice of when you just maybe think about it as being in one way, but then it just kind of ripples out. So yeah, that's a lot of what my social practice work is about, is just finding a place that people can hang together and, work, make, the power of making things.
Yeah. So the big question for all of you, thinking specifically about Earth Day today and figuring out how we can make changes to our own lives, what do you hope people will take away from your work, and how that will ultimately reflect in their personal lives? Big question. Yeah.
Richard?
Yeah, we're throwing the ball over around here.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think Michelle said it really well. It's like, as an artist, you can't have unrealistic expectations about, necessarily what you can affect just on a personal level with your art. I think you just have to kind of, express the things you see that concern you, and then just hope that becomes part of the dialogue that's out there. And these dialogues, I think they kind of, they spread from you and come back to you. So, you just try and be a part of the dialogue, I'd say.
Yeah, I found since about 2005, concertedly, the main focus of the art has been ecological devastation, species loss, preservation of land, and climate change. So focusing all the tools that we were learning and building over the many years in expressing ourselves and making narratives that are absurd, using costumes to create narratives, having a focus that feels as heartfelt as this and desperate as this does to me, helps me focus the work and give some kind of purpose to my life. So I'm just trying to hope that people can take anything of that passion and move it towards a kind of a gentle revolution on their own and spread that in the little ways each of us does. If each of us just makes that part of their life more focused on that end goal of getting this all together for the larger planet, that's successful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we'll probably never know if there was an impact of what we did or not, but we just hope.
I mean, I think the beauty of art, you know, well, it's not always accessible to everybody. There's this definite gap between everybody and art itself. It's not always, you know, in some ways it's elitist because it's not always really clear what the story is. But as long as I think some people get to interact with that and then take something away from that, and they interact with other people and they interact with other people, that's where the power of art lies, that ultimately all these ideas will trickle down through dialogues, through conversations, through, you know, at my house, I've been talking about beds with my roommates and how that relates to COVID, and the fact that there's a lot of fallacies out there about beds and what that means. And, you know, that these are conversations that were inspired by the art itself. And, you know, I get a lot of access to that, but then it allows me to research and educate myself and have these conversations with the people in my life that don't necessarily have access to that. So I think, you know, what you're talking about, hoping that people, you know, that you reach these people in these different ways, I think, you know, that is exactly why art is so important to our cultural fabric, because it does reach those people through like waterfall, trickle down, and yeah. Stuff, optimism.
Yes, we try it. It's such a downer world view that's out there that we have to do something, and the art making is the most hopeful thing we can do when we're anxious about everything. It's what both Rich and I do. All our projects have been at base about our fears, and so we're transforming them into something beautiful and magical and mysterious and funny, and in that alchemy of doing that, hopefully it spreads as some kind of tool for other people to do the same.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of healing power in the fact that we get to admit that it is overwhelming and that it is upsetting and dark, and we're not alone in feeling that way. I think there's a lot of healing power in that on its own already.
Yeah.
So oh, sorry, go for it.
No, I'm saying again, you know, the comfort that we're all finding in just making things right now while we're all in this sort of unknown right now. There's a real power in that, and there's a power of hope in that, because it's really easy right now to get super hopeless. So
yeah. So we have a couple questions coming in as well, so I'd like to ask them to you before we disjourn. This question is from Roberta. This conversation also brings to mind a show that was at MoMA several years ago called Waste Not. It has a Chinese name, but I'm not going to butcher it. It's an exhibition of Chinese artist Song Dong that displays over 10,000 domestic objects formerly owned by his late mother, who refused to throw anything away if she could possibly reuse it. Are you familiar with this? Yeah.
Yeah, it was a beautiful show. It was all laid out on the main central square at MoMA, and it was spectacular. And then when one saw how amazing it was that she had done that, it definitely made you think about how much more we have in our houses, and what it would look like, and how we really, really don't need what we have. I collect far too much because I'm always thinking I can reuse it in the art. And I have a giant barn filled with stuff and the art that I made with the stuff. So that's frustrating because I'm trying to reduce, but then I'm always seeing a reusable way to do it.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haunt estate sales and garage sales all the time, and to find a sewing basket that has just loaded with all these textiles and tools and everything, and yeah, I have way too many of them. But somebody was also throwing them away, which is also kind of odd.
Yeah. I struggle with that as well, with my sentimentality and getting trinkets from people and not being able to give them away, and just collections upon collections of little things that people either put a lot of thought in or no thought in at all and gave it to me. And I'm like, this is so precious. I'll keep it forever. And yeah, hoarding of things is definitely a part of being human. And the next question is from Mary about the Mending Project. How can I find more about information about this?
Oh, we exist right now on an Instagram platform and Facebook, because that's how everything exists at this moment. And yeah, we are offering a few online kinds of deals that are happening, which is virtual, but somehow we'll virtually make things together. But we'll see. Yeah, Instagram, To Do a Mending Project is what it's called.
Great. So my final question for you guys is how you're celebrating Earth Day today.
I'm going. You first, Richard.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah. As soon as I'm out of the interview, I'm going to head outside. I've been basically I've been getting out most days and walking around the forests and stuff near the river. I've seen all kinds of amazing birds. I've seen eagles of various kinds, woodpeckers, hawks, vultures. So yeah, I'm just heading out into nature to take a walk.
I'm going to go out to my driveway the moment this is done and get my wheelbarrow there. And next to my Prius that I had to get a few weeks ago when my car got crashed into, there is a giant Prius-sized pile of locally made compost that I'm going to be barrowing out to my raised bed garden that I've built since the coronavirus hit, and start piling more and more of the soil in there while I look out over the marsh and watch the beaver and his exploits, how well he's reformed my landscape. And back and forth I'll go with my barrow, moving earth on Earth Day.
Yeah, I'm going out to the garden. I have a purple cauliflower that is just going to be perfect for dinner tonight. You know, you just wait till it's big enough. I have an amazing garden. And one of the joys that I just discovered is that the bees have moved in under the shed in our backyard and have made themselves a home. And it makes me feel incredibly happy that they have a home here. Not a beehive, but under the shed hive.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. You should get a webcam in there and give them their own channel.
Oh, I probably should. Yeah. And my chickens have just graduated to the coop from the little, so yeah, I have a little bit of a farm in a suburban kind of way, but I have a 1/4 acre farm and I'm really happy with it. I should take you on a tour, but.
Ooh. Well, you're giving us a tour, next week, right?
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
I'll do art and garden.
Yes, there we go. So Michelle, I am curious because I love recipes. What are you making with the purple cauliflower?
Oh, I know. Well, there's two options. One is where you just take an egg wash over it and sprinkle it with Parmesan cheese and bake it. Oh, that's just heavenly. I think that's the one I'm going to go with because I think the hen just laid an egg. So I got it all.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So we got one more question, and this is from Leah. Nicholas, you spoke about wearing animal costumes and how that lends you to the possibility of seeing in less human-centric ways. The question is for Michelle. Is that part of what you hope to the occupation of the hanging pieces can do? Invite an awareness of sense of belonging to a more natural world?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Yeah, I hoped, again, you know, and it was kind of fun because when I was on a residency and hanging them, folks from the residency would take part. And when you would climb in, there was a bit of a reminiscence to when you would go and be in a tree fort or maybe climb in a hollow of a tree when you were a kid, or make your fort in your, you know, out of your sofa and all those sorts of things. And so I was really hoping for that connection to these tree-like kinds of forms, that you would feel a part of it there would not be a separation. You could actually be in like costume, very much like the polar bear costume. And the other thing that happens with that is that, interestingly enough, the friends who donated, the clothing, even though it was clean, came with scent. And very often you would smell the person. And for me, it was a reminiscence because I knew that friend of mine always wore that particular perfume or whatever. And so you would climb in or, you know, interact with these pieces and also gain that scent of someone else also. So.
I love that. Well, thank you three so much for joining us today for this Earth Day celebration and talking about, you know, the ecological issues and concerns that you talk about in your work. I think, you know, hopefully everybody attending today will, you know, talk about some of the ideas that you brought up and have this trickle down through, you know, their groups and, you know, art. Great. So everybody knows tomorrow we'll have a previously in AiR episode with Judy Tulowitz-Stewa, who will give us a tour of her studio at home in New Mexico, show us what she's been working on. And then Friday we have the curatorial panel discussion. This kitty is hungry. Curatorial panel discussion about Nicholas and Richard's work and kind of curating at the end of the world and thinking about those concepts from a curatorial perspective. And then on Saturday, we'll have our second studio visit with Nicholas and Richard to see what they've been up to with the residency and the work that they've created. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much for joining us, and everybody have a wonderful Earth Day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.